Nicola's father is Nelson Peltz. You can even see Brooklyn in a picture here in the Google search. And Nicola and Elon Musk. He's worth
Nicola Peltz is reportedly getting $1 million a month from her dad, Nelson Peltz, which sounds like a ton of money, but remember, her dad is a billionaire. So how much does $1 million a month even mean to him? And how did he get so rich that even the Beckhams look budget in comparison?
How's married life treating you guys?
Oh my God, it is so much fun. You know, marrying your best mate is just, it's the best. It's the best.
Yeah, people always say you should marry your best friend.
It's true. It's the best advice, yeah. We feel like we're on like a play date.
What if the real drama in the Beckham family isn't happening on Instagram, but in the silence no one is talking about? What if Brooklyn Beckham didn't just walk away from his parents, but walked straight into a different kind of power? And what if the most influential person in this entire story hasn't said a single word publicly? Because while the world keeps watching Brooklyn, Nicola, David, and Victoria trade subtle shots through posts, interviews, and awkward absences, there's one name that quietly sits above the chaos like a shadow nobody wants to mention out loud. Nelson Peltz. A billionaire. A strategist. A man who doesn't play celebrity games. He plays long games. And insiders keep whispering the same uncomfortable question. Did something happen behind closed doors that completely shifted Brooklyn's position inside this marriage? Not a scandal. Not a fight. Not a public blow-up. A move. A quiet, calculated move that changed how everyone in this story now sees Brooklyn Beckham. Because suddenly, the son of David Beckham doesn't look like the center of power anymore. He looks small. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The strange thing about this entire situation is that nobody can point to one explosive moment where everything broke. There was no screaming match caught on camera. No leaked audio. No dramatic interview where someone exposed everything. Instead, what people noticed was a shift. A slow, uncomfortable, almost invisible shift in the way Brooklyn Beckham started moving. He stopped looking like a Beckham and started looking like a guest in someone else's empire. At first, nobody thought much of it. Marriage changes people. New family, new environment, new routines. That's normal. That's expected. But insiders say this didn't feel like adjustment. It felt like replacement. Brooklyn's world didn't expand after the wedding. It narrowed. And it narrowed toward one direction only, the Peltz orbit. The appearances changed. The social circles changed. The tone changed. Even the way he spoke in interviews started sounding different. More measured. More careful. Almost like every sentence had passed through an invisible filter before reaching the public. And that's when whispers started. Because when someone grows, their personality becomes bigger. But when someone is absorbing influence, their personality becomes quieter. And people who had known Brooklyn for years began saying the same thing privately. He doesn't sound like himself anymore. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a conspiracy way. Just in a subtle, unsettling way. The kind you only notice when you've watched someone grow up. Then came the wedding story. Not the glamorous photos. Not the celebrity guest list. Not the luxury venue. The dance. The moment that, according to Brooklyn, changed everything. A mother stepping into what was meant to be a private moment between him and his wife. On the surface, it sounds small. Almost petty. But emotionally, symbolically, it was massive. Because weddings are about territory. About space. About who stands where in someone's life. And insiders say that moment didn't embarrass Brooklyn as much as it signaled something to Nicola. That Brooklyn was still emotionally anchored somewhere else. And from that point on, lines started being drawn. Very quietly. Very firmly. Invitations became complicated. Family visits became rare. Conversations became formal. And then something happened that pushed this from family tension into something far more serious. The legal boundaries. When communication between parents and son reportedly started going through representatives and legal channels, people in both circles realized this was no longer emotional fallout. This was structural. Because families argue. But families don't usually lawyer up unless trust has completely collapsed. And this is where the focus slowly shifted toward the one person who wasn't arguing, wasn't speaking, and wasn't appearing in headlines. Nelson Peltz. Because while the Beckhams were emotional, reactive, and visibly hurt, Nelson remained exactly the same. Calm. Silent. Watching. People familiar with his world say he doesn't operate on emotion. He operates on positioning, but he doesn't react to situations. He waits for them to reveal weaknesses. And suddenly, Brooklyn's public conflict with his own parents started looking less like rebellion and more like a vulnerability, because in elite power circles, cutting off your family doesn't look brave. It looks unstable. It raises questions about judgment, about loyalty, about long-term reliability, and whether fair or unfair, those perceptions matter deeply in the kind of world the Peltz family operates in. Then another detail resurfaced that made people even more uncomfortable. The prenup. A strict agreement set before the wedding that made one thing crystal clear. If the marriage ever ended, Brooklyn would walk away with nothing from the Peltz fortune. Only what he and Nicola built together. At first glance, that sounds practical, responsible, normal for billionaires. But when you place that detail next to everything else, the family fallout, the isolation, the shift in circles, it starts to feel less like financial protection and more like leverage. Because if Brooklyn has cut ties with his original support system, and his financial future is locked behind the success of this marriage, where exactly does his independence live? That's the question nobody asks out loud, but everyone quietly thinks. Then came comments from someone completely unexpected. Brooklyn's former youth coach. A man with no reason to pick sides. No media agenda. No celebrity loyalty. He didn't attack David and Victoria. He didn't defend Brooklyn. He simply described a childhood that didn't look as glamorous from the inside as it did from the outside. Security at 14. Constant monitoring. Pressure to represent perfection. And for the first time, people began seeing that this story didn't start at the wedding. It started years earlier. A boy raised in a world where privacy didn't exist, growing into a man desperate to find a place where he could feel in control of his own life. And that's where things become emotionally complicated. Because maybe Brooklyn didn't run toward the Peltz world for power. Maybe he ran there for peace. But peace and power can sometimes look very similar from the outside. Especially when one family operates on legacy and the other operates on dominance. One values emotional bonds. The other values structure and control. And Brooklyn now lives entirely inside the second system. Not visiting it, living in it. Which is why the biggest question surrounding this entire situation is not who is right, but who has influence. Because influence doesn't have to shout. It doesn't have to demand. It simply reshapes how someone sees the world over time. And the longer this situation continues, the more people notice something uncomfortable. Nicola never had to leave her world to be with Brooklyn. Brooklyn had to leave his. And that shift alone changes the entire power balance of this story. Without a single argument. Without a single accusation. Without a single public statement from the one man at the center of it all. Nelson Peltz. Still silent. Still watching. Still saying nothing. And somehow, that silence feels louder than anything anyone else has said. What makes this situation even more unsettling is not what people can see, but what they can't. Because the louder Brooklyn speaks about freedom, the quieter his surroundings seem to become. And silence, in powerful environments, is never accidental. It's strategic. People started noticing something strange in the way Brooklyn's public image began shifting after the fallout. Not collapsing. Not exploding. Just redirecting. His projects changed. His focus changed. Even his online presence began to feel curated in a way that didn't feel organic. Cooking videos. Lifestyle branding. Soft, controlled content that felt safe, pleasant, uncontroversial. Nothing sharp. Nothing risky. Nothing that would create waves. Almost like someone had advised him, stay likable. Stay neutral. Stay small. And that's when industry observers began whispering a very uncomfortable theory. Brooklyn wasn't being pushed. He was being positioned. Positioned as non-threatening. Positioned as agreeable. Positioned as someone who fits quietly into a much bigger machine without disturbing it. Because in families where power runs deep, the most valued trait isn't talent. It's predictability. And Brooklyn, with his career pivots from photography to cooking to branding, didn't exactly scream predictability before. But now he does. And that transformation didn't go unnoticed. Meanwhile, the Beckham side of the story kept looking emotionally raw. David and Victoria, despite saying very little publicly, reportedly kept the door open. Friends of the family say they never escalated, never retaliated, never exposed private details. They simply waited. And that waiting started to look painful. Because when parents are quiet while a child is loud, people start asking why. Why aren't they defending themselves? Why aren't they correcting the narrative? Why aren't they fighting back? The answer insiders suggest is simple. They believe this isn't a fight they can win publicly. Because this isn't about facts. It's about influence. Then came the detail that made people in celebrity circles raise their eyebrows even higher. Brooklyn reportedly stopped attending events where his parents might be present. Not occasionally. Consistently. Birthdays. Gatherings. Public celebrations. Avoided. At first, it seemed like emotional distance. But over time, it started to look like policy. And policies don't come from emotion. They come from structure. That's when observers started noticing a pattern that felt too consistent to ignore. Brooklyn's world had become incredibly controlled in its exposure. Who is seen with, where he appears, what he posts, what he says. Everything felt measured. Because here's the uncomfortable truth people began circling around. When someone is truly free, they become more expressive. But when someone is navigating a powerful environment carefully, they become more cautious. And Brooklyn now moves like someone who is very, very careful. Then the siblings became part of the silent comparison. Romeo, Cruz, Harper, still close, still visible with their parents, still interacting naturally. No legal lines, no public distance, no formal tone. Which raised a question nobody could answer easily. If the Beckham household was as suffocating as Brooklyn describes, why did only one child feel the need to escape it completely? That contrast added fuel to an already uncomfortable fire. Because it suggested this story wasn't about a toxic family. It was about a very specific emotional journey belonging to one person. And that person had now placed himself inside a family system known for discipline, hierarchy, and power structure. A system where image isn't emotional. It's strategic. Then there's Nelson again. Always Nelson. Because the more this situation evolves, the more people realize he never had to do anything publicly to shape it. His influence doesn't come from statements. It comes from environment. The homes, the circles, the expectations, the unspoken standards. And insiders familiar with billionaire family dynamics say something fascinating. In these environments, no one tells you what to do. You simply learn what is acceptable by watching what gets approved and what gets ignored. And over time, you adjust yourself without realizing it. That's the kind of influence that doesn't feel like control. It feels like adaptation. Which is why some people believe Brooklyn may not even realize how much he has changed. Not because he's weak, but because he's adjusting to survive in a system far more powerful than celebrity fame. Because here's the key difference: the Beckhams are famous. The Peltzes are powerful. And those are not the same thing. Fame lives in headlines. Power lives in boardrooms. And Brooklyn has moved from one world into the other. That transition is massive. And people don't make that shift without being reshaped by it. Then came another subtle sign. Brooklyn stopped talking about his past. In interviews, in posts, in stories, references to childhood, memories, family traditions slowly faded. Not erased, just minimized. Which is something psychologists often associate with identity transitions. When someone is trying to build a new sense of self, they quietly detach from the narrative that formed the old one. And that's exactly what this looks like. He isn't attacking his past anymore. He's simply not referencing it. That silence speaks volumes. Because the loud anger phase is over. Now comes the quiet distancing phase. And that phase is harder to reverse. Because anger can cool, but detachment can settle permanently. Meanwhile, public sympathy is split right down the middle. Some people see a man standing up for his wife and choosing his own path. Others see a man who may have underestimated the emotional cost of isolating himself from the only system that knew him before fame, before marriage, before pressure. And somewhere between those two views sits the truth. A truth that nobody inside this situation is fully saying out loud. This isn't just a family feud anymore. This is a complete restructuring of Brooklyn Beckham's identity, support system, and power position in life. And the most fascinating part? It happened without a single explosive event. Just slow, quiet, strategic shifts. The kind you only recognize when you step back and look at the entire picture. And when people do that, they start realizing this story was never about one argument, one dance, or one post. It was about where Brooklyn belongs now. And whether he still has a place in the world he came from. By the time people started realizing how deep this situation had gone, it was already too late to call it a misunderstanding. Because misunderstandings get cleared up. This settled in. What once looked like temporary emotional distance now looks like a permanent structural divide. And the most uncomfortable part? Nobody can point to a single villain. There's no shouting match to replay. No scandal to dissect. No proof of manipulation. Just outcomes. And sometimes, outcomes tell louder stories than accusations ever could. Brooklyn now lives in a world where everything is calm, polished, controlled, and carefully presented. No public chaos. No emotional outbursts. No messy family exchanges. Just smooth, pleasant, curated life. Which, on the surface, looks perfect. But for people who have watched celebrity families for decades, that kind of perfection often raises more questions than drama does. Because real life is messy. And when the mess disappears completely, it usually means it has been pushed somewhere private, somewhere quiet, somewhere invisible. Then comes the question nobody asks Brooklyn directly. If you are truly free, why does your life look more restricted than before? Restricted not in movement, but in expression. He no longer speaks impulsively. He no longer jokes loosely. He no longer shares casually. Everything feels like it passes through a mental filter first. And that's when observers began noticing something that changed the tone of this entire story. Brooklyn doesn't sound angry anymore, he sounds resolved. And resolution is much harder to undo than anger. Because anger can be temporary. Resolution is a decision. A settled belief. A new reality someone has accepted fully. Which means the distance from his parents isn't an emotional reaction anymore. It's a chosen position. Meanwhile, David and Victoria's side continues to do the one thing that keeps people emotionally invested. They wait. They don't attack. They don't defend loudly. They don't expose private details. They simply keep the door open. And that quiet patience creates a powerful contrast. Because in family conflicts, the side that keeps talking often looks defensive. The side that stays calm often looks hurt. And public perception slowly begins to shift towards sympathy for the silence. Then there's the question of return. Not today. Not tomorrow. But someday. What happens if Brooklyn ever decides he wants to reconnect? That's where the real tension of this story sits. Because walking away is emotionally dramatic. But walking back requires humility from every direction. And insiders say this situation has gone so far that even if Brooklyn wanted to reconnect, the path back wouldn't be simple anymore. Too many statements have been made. Too many legal lines have been crossed. Too many emotional boundaries have been hardened. And then there's the factor nobody wants to say out loud. Would Nicola even feel comfortable stepping back into that world? Would Nelson? Because at this level of power and pride, reconciliation isn't just emotional. It's political. It's about who bends first. And powerful families are not known for bending easily. Which means Brooklyn may be standing at a crossroads he doesn't even realize exists yet. A future moment where he may have to choose again. Not between wife and parents, but between identity and isolation. Because here's what observers are slowly starting to agree on: this story isn't about control from either side. It's about where Brooklyn feels safest. And right now, he clearly feels safest inside the Peltz structure. The problem is, safety and independence are not always the same thing. And the longer someone stays inside a powerful structure, the harder it becomes to step outside it without feeling lost. That's the psychological weight hanging over this entire situation. Not drama, not scandal, but permanence. Because the longer this distance lasts, the more it stops feeling temporary and starts feeling like a new normal. A new version of Brooklyn Beckham that the Beckham family no longer fully recognizes. And perhaps, a version of himself that Brooklyn no longer compares to the old one either. Then there's the legacy factor. David Beckham built his life on loyalty, endurance, and long-term vision. Nelson Peltz built his on leverage, structure, and dominance. Two very different philosophies, two very different worlds. And Brooklyn now lives entirely inside one of them. Which means, whether intentionally or not, he has stepped away from the value system he was raised in and stepped into a completely different one. That kind of shift doesn't just change relationships. It changes how someone sees life itself. And that's why this story keeps making people uncomfortable. Because nobody can say Brooklyn is wrong. But nobody can say this looks simple either. It looks heavy, layered, complicated, and strangely quiet for something this emotionally loud. In the end, the loudest presence in this entire saga remains the man who has said nothing from day one. Nelson Peltz. Still silent. Still uninvolved publicly. Still never needing to step into the spotlight. Because the environment he represents speaks loudly enough on its own. And Brooklyn, whether by choice or circumstance, now represents that environment too. Which leaves one final, haunting thought that people can't shake. Did Brooklyn escape pressure? Or did he trade one form of pressure for another that simply feels more comfortable? That's the question nobody inside this story is answering. And maybe nobody can. Because sometimes, the most powerful shifts in life happen so quietly that by the time you realize how much has changed, you no longer remember what it felt like before. So now the real question isn't who's right and who's wrong. The real question is, what did this situation turn Brooklyn Beckham into? Because when you step back and look at the entire picture, the wedding moment, the legal distance, the silence, the shifting circles, the calm exterior, the careful words, it stops looking like celebrity drama. It starts looking like a life that quietly changed direction in ways most people didn't even notice happening. And that's why this story hits so hard. Not because of shouting, not because of scandal, but because of silence. Because sometimes, the loudest stories are the ones where nobody is openly fighting anymore, yet everything has already been decided. Do you think Brooklyn truly found independence? Or do you think he simply moved from one powerful system into another? Do you see a man protecting his marriage at all costs? Or a man who slowly disconnected from the only world that knew him before fame, pressure, and expectation? And the biggest question of all, if one day Brooklyn ever wanted to reconnect with his parents, would that even be emotionally possible anymore? Or has too much time, too much pride, and too much distance already built a wall that can't be taken down? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this isn't a simple story, and there isn't a simple answer. Everyone watching this sees something different. Some see strength, some see influence, some see love, some see isolation. And that's exactly why this story refuses to fade away. Because it forces you to think beyond headlines and look at the psychology behind power, family, loyalty, and identity. If you enjoy deep dives that go beyond surface gossip and explore the uncomfortable questions nobody else is asking, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay locked in. Because the next story we're breaking down might look glamorous on the outside too. But once you peel back the layers, you'll see there's always more happening beneath the surface than anyone wants to admit. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.